A while back, I posted a video called I Solved Marvel Champion. If you haven't seen that video, make sure to go check it out. I'll link it in the description. And while you're at it, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the videos in the future. And I got a lot of feedback on it, but there was some things that I felt like I needed to address with that feedback. Most of it came from Reddit, some of it from my Discord, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit about that and also clarifying how to use the list, because a lot of what the feedback was, I feel like, was people assuming that I meant something different by my list because I said it was a guide. But anyways, I'll go into that later. So here I'm going to go over how I would use this list, because this is not saying that for every character that you would get, you just start at the top and then go downwards and then that's your deck. So if I was going to build a Miles Morales deck, for instance, I would want to look at what allies on here do I have access to that are high up on the list that my character can make good use of. So, for instance, starting at the top, Moon Girl works for champions. So, for a champion, Miles is a champion, so I would really consider putting that in the deck. So I'd go Moon Girl works, White Fox, very good for some heroes, not good for others. Skip on Miles because he doesn't discard. Then I would look at Web Warriors, so like I'd grab Spider-Man Otto Octavius, Ghost Spider, Peter Parker, Hobie Brown, and then somewhere in this tier, I would start looking at it situationally. So once I have those allies in, I would look like, do I want to grab SPDR? She's cut off here a little bit. But I'd probably grab SPDR and Scarlet Spider in here because even though they're lower on the list, because they're Web Warriors, they're going to synergize with my deck better. And when I'm considering synergies, you can see Snowguard, for instance, is higher up on the list here than SPDR, but because of the synergies that with the Web of Life and Destiny and other Web Warrior cards, I would definitely include Scarlet Spider here and SPDR before I included Snowguard. So then after that, if I'm just trying to make the deck as strong as I can, I would look at allies that are high up that I have access to. So I'd start at the top again, look, Nick Fury, very strong. He's not trait locked or anything, so him, but I wouldn't grab Forge because I'm not playing X-Men supports. And then I'd look, do I want card draw? I could grab Ironheart, Professor X, which confuses. And then you see up here, this is why I made it auto-include sections, because these allies from Zesty to auto-include will basically always make your deck stronger as long as you can use them. So then for great options in here, now is when I'd consider like Mockingbird and Snowguard, and I'd just start tailoring my deck to how I wanted it there. So these high efficiency allies are going to fill open deck slots after I've already grabbed things that are trait locked or have specific synergies with my deck. Another thing that this would be good for is deciding between allies that are very close in strength, which I didn't see really anyone commenting about, but that was one of the things I was most excited about for this list. Was let's say you're playing an X-Men character, and then you're looking to see, do I want to include Deathlock or Deadpool? It's really hard to decide between those allies because they're very close. But after doing that, making the list and doing all of that math, I now can say that Deathlock is slightly better than Deadpool. Whereas before, I didn't feel like I could answer that question. So if I'm like, oh, Deathlock or Deadpool, I have no idea. And if I'm like, and I just want to make it stronger and not necessarily thematic, I would choose Deathlock. The allies in this situationally good tier could slot into decks based off of the scenario. For instance, Vivian can be extremely strong against certain villains and not as good against other villains. Lockjaw and Machine Man are good examples of if your character has a lot of resources, you don't want to like have those resources be dead in your hand if you can't afford anything. So you can throw in Lockjaw and Machine Man, and then you have something to do with those excess resources. But if you're playing a hero without resources, like abundant resources, they're not going to be as good. So that's why I put them in situationally good, because allies in here have specific uses that can be very strong, but aren't necessarily always good like these allies above them tend to be. On this slide, I've shown basically all the allies that came up in the feedback that I'll be addressing in this video. So certain feedback about White Fox, and then trait locked allies in general, and then these red ones here, people were more upset about slash just had more feedback. It was varied whether people were like upset or trying to or just mad at me versus just constructive feedback. But I'll address both here. And then one thing that I wanted to mention as overall is an overall concept that I wanted to mention was swinging web kick is widely considered to be a very good card. 3 printed cost for 8 damage is really good. It's kind of like the standard for how you evaluate events. And based off how I've done this efficiency calculation, which you can, I'll link another video that's really good where I specifically go over swinging web kick. It comes out to 2.0, which puts swinging web kick right with War Machine. So a fantastic card that is widely loved by everyone is right here in the situationally good, which is basically because allies tend to be like the best cards in the game. You get more value out of these allies than you will from events in general. Obviously, like swing web kick will end a game better than these allies, but I think it makes sense for it to be in situationally good because a lot of the times you're not going to play swing web kick. If you're trying to set up your hero or you need to thwart or many other reasons, you don't always want to do 8 damage. That's not what you're looking to do. But then at the end of the game, when you're trying to burst the villain down, it's fantastic. So swing web kick is a great example of like what situationally good means. And then these allies that are in the tiers below, it's not saying that they're horrible. It's just saying that I would probably rather play swing web kick than these allies. I want to go over this first before going into specific allies, because this is a general overarching criticism that I saw from multiple different people. A person on Reddit, I'm not going to name any names because this isn't about like calling out certain people. This is just about feedback that I received and many people also agreed with. So they said Colossus, Drax, Gamora, Ghost Spider, Angel, Rocket Raccoon all have tribal requirements to be efficient and thus are situational. Thus, they are not always great options and certainly not auto-includes. I found this to be interesting because having a trait-locked character, they're generally trait-locked because they have traits, they have abilities that are way stronger than a normal ally would have. So they don't want to make it widely accessible. I don't really view this as a detriment because they're not going to go into a deck where I can't play them. So like Ghost Spider, for instance, I'm not going to put in my Captain America deck because I can't play the card. So I didn't make that a downside to the allies. Angel, I think, is a interesting example of this because he's not actually trait locked. He just gets a benefit if you have the mutant or X-Men trait. So if you look at him as a 3-cost ally with 2 attack and 3 health, that's fine. Like it's not bad. It's just fine. But then reducing his cost makes him an incredible ally, which shows like the power gap between allies that are trait locked versus not trait locked. And I didn't want to hold that against him because it didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I wasn't going to nerf Ghost Spider or Gamora on my list because they don't work for heroes that can't play them, basically. And this brings up another interesting thing, is because they specifically said efficient, which they didn't watch my, they probably didn't watch my video, I'm guessing, but part of why I made it was to kind of clear up what efficient means and like provide an easier way to talk about it, because I think I had that meme in there of like everyone just yelling efficient back at each other, but they're all talking about different things, which the only way these wouldn't be like efficient is if you're playing it in a deck that can't play them, and then it's just a resource. But that doesn't really make sense to me of like how to talk about efficient, because how do you say something's efficient if you can't even play it? Anyways, just wanted to address that first. Now, onto the specifics. So I created a little podium here because these are the allies that I received the most criticism about. Cannonball was by far the one that was talked about the most and seemed to be the one that people were disagreed with me the most on. And Blade came in second. I was kind of surprised to see this, but people were saying that Venom and Star-Lord are much better, deserve to be much higher on the list. Then I have some honorable mentions down here with Agent 13, Ghost Spider, and White Fox. I already talked about it a little bit with trait locks and how that works, but I want to go into Agent 13 and White Fox more specifically later on. So now, onto the first ally, Cannonball. A lot of the different comments I got on Cannonball can be summarized by this one. They said, I just played a few games with an Angel Aggression aerial deck. Cannonball was a must-play card because it's basically free actions for life. He never took consequential damage across several games because I always had aerial cards in hand. I want to start by saying I agree with this comment, and I would always include Cannonball in an Angel deck, and here's why. If you look at Angel's kit, he has all these different aerial events with multiple copies. So we have Adaptive Plumage, Aerial Agility, Metamorphosis, Natural Flight, Razor Dive, and there's multiple copies of these, bringing up to 10 out of the 15 cards in his deck are aerial traded. So going back to Cannonball, when you would take damage, reduce that by the amount of aerial cards in your hand. So when 10 of your cards are already aerial, and then you add in other aerial events that Angel has access to, a large portion of your deck will be aerial. Angel is further incentivized to add even more aerial events because he gets to draw cards from it. So clearly, Cannonball is a great ally for Angel. The reason I didn't put Cannonball higher is because Angel isn't the only aerial character. In fact, there's a lot of different aerial characters, and you'll see in a second that they don't have nearly as many aerial cards in their deck as Angel. So, if you look at these characters, in the core box, you'll see Iron Man and Captain Marvel. They both have access to the aerial trait. Neither of them have an aerial traded card. Thor doesn't have one. Doctor Strange doesn't have one. Wasp doesn't have one. Star-Lord actually does have one, but only one. And then Rocket doesn't have one. Spectrum only has one, which is the ally. Valkyrie, none. Vision, none. Nova, none. Ironheart, none. Phoenix, none. Storm, none. And Rogue, 0. But there's one character that I haven't talked about yet. And here he is. Aerial as a trait is something that's in a hero kit, but they have to play a specific card, and then they gain access to that aerial trait. And that activates, or that gives them access to the aerial events, like Dive Bomb, for instance, that tend to be stronger. Some characters, like Spectrum, have it printed on their identity card, so they'll always have access to those aerial events. Nova basically always has it because of the helmet. But all these other ones have to do something specific to get aerial. So throwing in a bunch of aerial cards into your deck that you won't always have access to because you aren't guaranteed to get the card that allows you to become aerial would be an unbalanced way to build your deck. So if you threw in 10 aerial events to any of these heroes, with the exception of Nova and Spectrum, it would basically ruin their decks. And that's just to get it up to the point of Angel as if he didn't add any extras. So that's why I have Cannonball lower, is because it doesn't work for these other aerial characters. I think it's better to think of Cannonball as like Angel's 16th card, as opposed to instead of a card that aerial characters can use. So, in summary, Angel, very good with Cannonball. Every other aerial character, not so much. This is another comment that I got that kind of relates back to the other ones, but also wraps in Cannonball. So they said, playing an aerial killer character is as much of a limitation as being a guardian or a web warrior. that you place some of those allies very high. I don't really agree with playing those characters as a limitation. So I think what they meant is that if you want to play Ghost Spider or Gamora, you would have to choose a hero that's a Web Warrior or a Guardian. And that is limiting because you won't be able to play them with any of the characters, but I went over that a bit earlier of like I don't think that makes a lot of sense to hold that against Ghost Spider and Gamora. So the way I think of it is that choosing a character that is a Guardian or a Web Warrior, for instance, gives you access to cards that are way stronger than normal, and it's a strength of a character because the hero card could have been printed without any of those, and then you wouldn't even have those cards. So like, it's a benefit to me that Star-Lord has the Guardian trait, or Drax has the Guardian trait. Or if I want to play a Web Warrior like Miles or Gwen or Spider-Ham or something, it's a powerful thing that is printed right on there. So like you can think about like Peter Parker, he has to play a card just to get the trait so that he can have access to those powerful allies, and it's worth it. You can see some gameplay videos of Web Warrior Fanatic where he's playing Peter Parker Spider-Man with the Web Warrior card, and then taking on some of the strongest villains in the game. Cannonball isn't very good for most of the aerial characters, with the exception of Angel, whereas Ghost Spider and Gamora are very good for the Guardians and the Web Warriors. So like I would include Ghost Spider in basically any Web Warrior deck and feel good about it. And for Gamora, like that, she's also good in basically any Guardian deck you build. So I think that's just sort of different. I don't think it's a great comparison here. And this brings me to the other comparison where I wanted to talk about White Fox. So this person said, I also have no idea why Cannonball is in the bottom row, since in the right deck, he's essentially 3 costs for a permanent 2 attack/thwart. White Fox is another character that is mediocre in most decks, but amazing in others, and she's in the top row. This is an interesting comment because White Fox, I agree, you shouldn't put her in just any deck. So White Fox is evaluated only with characters that can discard, and Cannonball was evaluated only with characters that can go aerial. And even in these decks, it's not a good idea to play White Fox from the hand. She's a 3/1/1/3, which is worse than if the Angel ally didn't have his ability. I wouldn't add either of these allies to a deck that can't use their ability. So I think Iron Man is probably the best example of this because he's an aerial character and he can also discard. So for Iron Man, he doesn't have a single aerial card, and what he wants to do is go through his deck really fast so he can get set up. So adding a bunch of aerial events will just kind of like slow down his deck, so he doesn't really want to do that. And then Cannonball basically is useless for him because he won't have any aerial cards in his deck. Whereas White Fox is very useful because he has a couple copies of Repulsor Blast, which is going to discard 5 cards off the top of the deck. She's an energy resource, which counts for that. And when she's discarded, she'll come back into play. So it's one of the strongest combos you'll see in the game. Similarly, Domino works very well with White Fox because you can order the deck and discard. Bishop, it's going to discard every time he takes damage, so we'll often be able to get White Fox into play for free. Adam Warlock discards cards for his event, and also for his hero events. Also, the Mystic events will discard off the top of the deck with Magic Attack and Zone of Silence. So as you can see, like all of these characters work extremely well with White Fox, whereas only 1 out of 17 aerial characters will work with Cannonball. So even if you build your deck with, like, let's say Nova or Spectrum, 2 of the better ones, Cannonball won't be able to attack every turn. So it's just a 2 attack that he won't take consequential damage, but then sometimes you won't be able to attack at all without discarding him, and sometimes he will take the consequential damage. So it's not really that impactful of an ability, whereas White Fox is an ally for free that can thwart and then block. That's very strong. So even in their good cases, White Fox's effect is much stronger than Cannonball's. That's pretty much why White Fox is high up on my list and Cannonball was low. Also, another thing to mention is that Iron Man's futurist ability will also work with White Fox. So she's good while he's setting up and after he's set up with Repulsor Blast. So that was pretty much everything with Cannonball. So now we're going to move to rank 2. Blade got the second most feedback on there. And this comment, I thought, basically summed up what most people were saying. They said, how can you put my man Blade down so far? 1 cost for a block is a good return, and in a deck that has Jarnborn, it's another way to trade fist resources for damage, and he works as a cheap way to get Earth's mightiest heroes to cook. He's good. So I think this is more so going back to like what I said in the first part, where I don't think Blade is actually that bad. He's just not as good as swinging web kick, and most of the other allies in that situationally good tier are comparable to swinging web kick. Are comparable to swinging web kick. Are comparable to swinging web kick. Swinging web kick. Are comparable to swinging web kick. Allies are just extremely strong, and the other allies happen to be better than Blade, in my opinion. So I think people were tending to ignore Blade's downsides. He discards himself if you don't specifically pay a physical from your hand. And a physical from your hand is not all that easy, because you're not always going to have a physical in your hand, and you also might need to play that card that has the physical resource. So people like Captain America with the physical resource generators can't actually use those generators for Blade's effect. This makes him not dispatchable, is a good way to put it, because his attack isn't on demand. He's less versatile. It's a similar thing to Cannonball, where they'll both discard themselves basically if you don't have the exact right conditions for them. When they say that the 1 cost for a block is a good return, I agree. That is a good return, and that would put him, if in that case where he's just 1 cost for a block, his efficiency would be 2.0, because it's 2 resources, including when you include Blade as a card leaving your hand, which I did for all of the allies on the list, and swinging web kick, and that puts him even with swinging web kick in his best case scenario. And then in his worst case scenario, he's just 2 cards leave your hand to get 2 damage, which is not good at all. So even in his best case scenario, he would only be in situationally good. And the reason I don't have him in there is because you're not always going to get the best case scenario for him. So it lowered him down below those other people. And the other part of the comment with the synergy with Earth's Mightiest Heroes, that's a great use for Blade. And also goes back to like the very beginning of this video, where if you have a specific synergy that you want to put into your deck, you should put that into your deck regardless of whether the ally is efficient on their own or not. Now, this synergy isn't as strong as something like the Web Warrior synergy, but it's still decent. So the idea is like you play Blade for 1 cost, and then it's a cheaper target for your Earth's Mightiest Heroes than the other allies would be. But that's not that much stronger than playing a 2 or 3 cost ally that can also work for Earth's Mightiest Heroes, that can also do things without needing to spend a physical resource from your hand. So I don't think that's enough to justify putting them up higher just because of that synergy when he's not really better than the other allies for that synergy. He's just slightly cheaper, with the downside of not being able to actually use the ally on their own when you want to. And this is another concept of where is it actually appropriate to add that value? Because the way I view this is Earth's Mightiest Heroes is the card that's getting that value, not Blade. I'm going to go over this later on with some more specific examples, but in general, I think it's appropriate to attribute the value to the card that's actually allowing you to do that thing. That deck that they mentioned, though, with getting Jarnborn into your deck is a great idea, because if you add more reasons to have physical resources into your deck, then you can skew your deck to have many more physical resources and increase the option for Blade to work. And I think that's a great idea. Blade also, I think, is a good ally for Hulk, because Hulk has a lot of physical resources as well, and then he's cheap, so Hulk can actually afford him. In certain decks, you should definitely use Blade. He's just not better than the other allies that are above him, in my opinion. There wasn't really specific comments to show for this, but I wanted to talk about how to account for synergies. Because a few different people thought that I should evaluate the Web Warriors with Web of Life and Destiny in play, which I totally understand where they're coming for with that, because you're encouraged to play this card. It costs 0 if you're a Web Warrior, and then it doesn't have a limit, so every time the ally leaves play, you'll get to draw a card, which is an incredibly powerful effect. But the value is coming from Web of Life and Destiny, not from the ally. And until you see Web of Life and Destiny, you're not going to have that power. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about how to use the list, because I wasn't trying to make the list where you can just go straight from top to bottom and build a deck that way. You need to definitely account for synergies when you're building that deck. And anytime you have a Web Warrior or another ally when you're playing a Web Warrior deck, definitely choose the Web Warrior, because this synergy is incredibly strong. This is sort of a special case, though. A more generic example of this would be team training. So this says that you just get to increase the hit points of your allies by 1. So this will allow them to get an extra attack or an extra block, which increases their value by a ton. But if you don't have team training out on the field, they don't get those extra attacks and extra blocks. It seems more fair to me to attribute the value that you get from team training to team training, and I wouldn't evaluate the leadership cards as if it was in play. So similarly with Web of Life and Destiny, I wanted the list to stand on its own, so I didn't evaluate the Web Warriors with it in play. It's just the allies based off their own merits. But because of the synergy with that, you should definitely include them in a deck where you're a Web Warrior before you include other allies. Again, that's just a special case. And also going back to the Blade argument with Earth's Mightiest Heroes, you're not going to have Blade and Earth's Mightiest Heroes in your hand every turn. And the value is still coming from Earth's Mightiest Heroes. So in the team training example illustrates more of what I was saying with Blade and that event. And again, you could always just use a better ally that's also an Avenger that would still work with Earth's Mightiest Heroes. So this one I was much more surprised about. I wasn't expecting to get a bunch of feedback saying that Star-Lord and Venom should be higher on my list. But anyways, this comment I think sums it up the best. They said Star-Lord and Venom are probably the two best allies in the game for the Age of Apocalypse campaign, but are in your bottom 2 rows. So the reason they were in my bottom 2 rows is because the encounter cards are bad, which this person is acknowledging because they're specifically saying the Age of Apocalypse campaign, which I agree, they're fantastic for the Age of Apocalypse, and they'll finish the mission side schemes better than almost any other ally you could use for that. But I think this just goes back to how my purpose of making the list, which they were interpreting it as I'm making this list as this is 100% how it works, and there's nothing that's going to change it. And tier lists are useless basically because they don't account for every situation. But I don't really agree with that viewpoint. My list was able to differ it. The list I made was really useful for many different reasons because it takes a more objective approach to evaluating the allies. And when you're using it for deck building, it's a tool. So if you notice a specific synergy like this, where they're great in a specific scenario, you should definitely include it. And then outside of that one specific scenario, you'll have I was able to give a more accurate representation of how beneficial these allies will be for you. And then another thing that no one really talked about with my list, which was one, I already mentioned this, but the ability to distinguish between allies that are very close to each other in strength is very useful. And it's really obvious to see that like Nick Fury is a great ally. And I thought it was obvious to see that these two were bad, but bad as far as allies go, but a lot of people disagreed with me on that. But anyways, I think almost everyone would agree that Nick Fury is a better ally than Star-Lord. But then in between that, it's really difficult to say like whether one ally is better than a different ally when they're not very obviously far apart. Which creating that list with doing the math helped me to distinguish all that at a much finer scale than I would have been able to otherwise. And another reason I didn't want to just add allies high just because of certain scenarios that they're good in was because many people will own Star-Lord or own Venom, but not even have the Age of Apocalypse. So it doesn't even really matter for them. So this list is going to be more generally useful by doing it this way. And this game isn't all about winning. It's not all about just making the strongest possible deck. So you should definitely play Star-Lord in a Guardian deck where you're just trying to have fun and you want to feel like Star-Lord just came into the battlefield and, oh, he's pretty strong and I got him for cheap. But also, hopefully this encounter card isn't bad. Like, that's his whole hero kit. Star-Lord is actually one of my favorite heroes in the game to play. The Star-Lord hero is also a lot stronger than the Star-Lord ally is, but the concept is fun. The point of the game is to have fun. So if you find a way to use Star-Lord that's fun for you, you should do that. Venom is one of my favorite allies in the game. When he showed up in that Sinister Motives campaign, it was amazing. Like, it felt like, wow, he's actually here. He has an interesting effect that no other ally has in the game. And I actually include him in my decks from time to time when I'm playing, when I just want to have a wild card that has a really strong effect, but I don't know how it's going to work. So in conclusion with these two, play them if you find a specific use for them, and play them if you want to just have fun. They're just not as strong as the other allies are. Okay, so the next ally I want to talk about is Agent 13. So this person said, Agent 13 is also really expensive and at times is too inefficient to be played against some villains and some hero decks that are resource starved. As such, she is solid, but definitely nowhere near an auto include. So that brings up a few different points that I want to make. The first thing, I guess, is I'm pretty sure this person didn't watch the video. They just responded to the picture of the list. Yeah, the too inefficient to be played against some villains and some hero decks is just kind of vague. I'm not sure exactly what they're talking about there. What I think they're saying, or maybe they're not saying this, but that if you don't have a shield support, that she's 4 cost without an ability, basically, which is pretty bad. That's definitely not how she should be played. So I evaluated her as if Helicarrier was in play, and then averaged that with how good she is if Helicarrier isn't in play. If it isn't in play, don't play it. When just Helicarrier is in play, she definitely deserves that position on the list because it's incredibly strong. So you shouldn't play Agent 13 before her ability can work. Unless it's just some really niche situation where you just need a blocker or you're almost dead or something like that, and you play her before you have a shield support, then she would be pretty bad. But it's not really that hard to just wait for one shield support. So if you see her in an early hand, like mulligan her if it's in the first hand, and if it's in your like second or third hand and you don't have a shield support yet, just use her as a resource. And then the next time you see her, she'll be incredibly strong. So I'd probably play her mid deck or the second pass through my deck. And getting Helicarrier down isn't that big of an ask, especially in multiplayer when it comes in the core set. A lot of people will have it in their deck, and if just one player has it, it doesn't have to be your Helicarrier. It just says after Agent 13 attacks or thwarts, choose a shield support, ready that support. And there's also other ones. So there's multiple copies of Government Liaison that you can play that will also essentially do the same thing when you have a shield deck. And to address the part about her being too expensive, when you have Helicarrier and Government Liaison on the field, she'll only be a 2 cost essentially, because you can reduce that down. So the cost burden, specifically with how the shield archetype works, and especially with cards like the Power in All of Us, makes it not really that difficult to play her, even if you don't have that much hand size. So I guess if I was to evaluate her as not having other shield cards in your deck and other people aren't playing Helicarrier either, then she wouldn't be very good. But whenever you're playing the shield archetype, or even if you're just playing multiplayer where multiple people have Helicarrier, she definitely deserves the auto include in my opinion. And she goes into basically every single shield deck I make and has great value for me. So that wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about in this video. I'll probably make more content about this farther down the line, because this opened up a lot of different interesting topics for me to cover, especially aerials. So like when I went through researching this to find out how many aerial cards are in the aerial decks, it was crazy to me to see that Spider-Man had 3 times more than Spectrum. That was just, I didn't realize it was that bad. Like I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize there were that few aerial traded cards in hero decks. And if you made it this far, again, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave me a comment. I respond to basically all my comments, and I like hearing from you all. And join the Discord. I wanted to take the time to shout out one of the people that's in my Discord, Pickle. If you're watching this, thank you for all the feedback. Pickle engaged really deeply with the list I made, and actually like checked out the code and looked at it, and found a couple things that I had coded slightly wrong. Specifically with Gamora, I had a bug where I forgot to add one of the extra card draws. And Snowguard, I counted the retaliate one too many times. Finding those was really helpful. Like, it didn't really change the list that much, because it just slid Gamora up like past Agent 13, and Snowguard stayed in the same spot because the 1 damage from the retaliate wasn't really that big of a deal. But it was still really nice having someone help me find that, because when you're sitting there 500 lines deep staring at a giant wall of code that has just like a comma out of place or like one number that's wrong, it can be hard to catch sometimes, and I appreciate that. And if you have time, check out my original video. Hopefully you watched that before this, the I solved Marvel Champions one, and the thermodynamic video I made that basically explains how I'm evaluating these efficiencies in general. That video didn't get a lot of views, but I think it's pretty good. If you're interested in how I came to the conclusions that I did and how I actually made the list, that would be a great video to watch. And till next time, stay zesty. See ya.